The airplane cabin hummed with the low, steady drone of engines, vibrating through polished floors and brushed metal overhead bins. Soft golden light from the reading lamps illuminated anxious faces, tired commuters, and a few lucky business travelers reclining with cocktails in hand. But amid the ordinary scene of mid-flight monotony, Monique Harris was anything but ordinary. Her first-class seat was more than just a luxurious perch. It was a throne from which she surveyed the cabin with a quiet, calculated poise. Clad in a sleek charcoal blazer over a crisp white blouse, Monique tapped lightly on the keyboard of her laptop, her long fingers gliding over the keys with practiced precision. Documents scrolled across the screen: contracts, flight manifests, schedules for her airline company. She was the founder and CEO of Harris Aviation, one of the fastest-growing private airlines in the country, a woman who had carved her empire from grit, vision, and sheer willpower. For Monique, this flight was supposed to be routine. Chartering her own plane ensured discretion, efficiency, and, most importantly, peace of mind. She enjoyed the rare luxury of traveling without scrutiny, yet there was a thrill in moving unnoticed among strangers, a reminder that power could often remain invisible until it chose to reveal itself. But the calm shattered before she even had a chance to sip her water. A young flight attendant, mid-20s, with slick-back hair and a tie slightly askew, strode down the aisle with the rigidity of someone walking a tightrope. His posture was stiff, his jaw clenched as though anticipating an invisible confrontation. His eyes locked on Monique as he approached, narrowing with judgment he hadn't fully thought through. "You can't be here. Move to coach," he barked. His voice cracked ever so slightly, betraying a nervousness he didn't want anyone to see. Monique raised her head, letting her gaze meet his. Calm, controlled, unshakable. There was no fear in her eyes, only the quiet authority of someone used to being underestimated and then proving them wrong. "Excuse me." Her voice was soft but carried a resonance that made heads turn. The attendant took an unsteady step closer, hand reaching as if to physically shepherd her backward. She didn't flinch. The tray table held her laptop and a notebook, both carefully arranged as if she had anticipated this moment. Her fingers drummed lightly on the laptop, a rhythmic, deliberate motion, signaling she was aware, composed, and not intimidated. "You don't belong here," he insisted, his tone now sharper, bordering on accusation. Sweat formed at the nape of his neck, and he glanced nervously at the passengers around them. Some leaned forward from their seats, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Others subtly lifted their phones, sensing a confrontation worth recording. Monique leaned back slightly, closing her laptop with a soft, deliberate click. She placed her hands on her lap, fingers intertwined, and fixed him with a gaze so steady it made the young man pause mid-step. "I think you need to check your facts," she said, her calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the attendant's flustered state. For a moment, the cabin fell into an uneasy silence. The soft whir of the engines and the occasional rustle of magazines filled the space, but all attention was now on the confrontation unfolding in the first-class aisle. I don't understand," the attendant stammered, stumbling over his words. His body tensed like a coiled spring ready to snap, yet uncertain in which direction. Monique straightened, her voice low and deliberate. "I own this plane." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. Heads turned, eyes widening, whispers rippling like tiny shockwaves through the cabin. Even passengers who had been immersed in movies or novels suddenly became aware of the drama, their curiosity aroused by the audacity of the statement. The attendant froze mid-step, a hand raised as if caught in the act of motion. His face paled. Confusion, fear, and a creeping awareness of personal humiliation flickered across his features. He glanced toward the senior attendant, hopping for a lifeline, only to see her hesitate, unsure of how to intervene without exacerbating the tension. Monique didn't rush. She didn't escalate. She simply sat, the picture of composed authority, as if her presence alone had redefined the social order of the cabin. Her gaze was unwavering, and there was a subtle smile playing at the corners of her lips, not arrogance, but the quiet confidence of someone who had survived every challenge life could throw at her. Passengers whispered. A businessman in the aisle across leaned toward his neighbor. She owns the plane." His voice carried disbelief, awe, and curiosity in equal measure. The neighbor shook his head, eyes wide. "I didn't even know that was possible. She just told him off." The young attendant swallowed hard. His pride, which had initially fueled his aggression, now seemed to fight against the sting of embarrassment and the weight of truth. He glanced at Monique again, realizing in a blink of an eye that this was not just a passenger demanding her seat. This was someone who had every right to be there, someone whose authority surpassed his comprehension. "Sir, please step aside," the senior attendant said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her voice was a mixture of command and reassurance, a rare attempt to mediate. "Let's handle this properly." Monique inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the gesture without rising. Her eyes never left the young attendant. "Yes," calmly, but firmly, she added, her tone gentle yet ironclad, an unspoken reminder that authority was not about intimidation, it was about principle. The young attendant hesitated, then backed away, shoulders slumped in reluctant surrender. The cabin's tension did not dissipate immediately. If anything, it thickened, charged with the passengers' awe, curiosity, and the faint stirrings of admiration for the woman who had just reminded everyone that power often went unseen until it chose to announce itself. Monique returned to her laptop, reopening the screen, resuming work as if the interruption had been a mere inconvenience. Yet beneath her calm exterior, a storm of awareness raged. Every glance, every whisper, every reaction had been noted. She had watched the interplay of authority, fear, and respect unfold in real time, and she had reminded them all of the unassailable truth. She belonged here. Suspense. Would the young attendant recover from the humiliation and attempt another challenge, or had Monique's composed authority permanently silenced the confrontation? And what ripple effects would this encounter have on the rest of the flight, where strangers now knew that a single black woman commanded an entire plane? The young attendant stumbled backward, as if the words, "I own this plane," had physically knocked the air from his lungs. His mind raced. Every rule, every training video, every reprimand flashed through him. Yet nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. A passenger, calm, poised, and unshakable, asserting authority not with volume, but with presence. Monique returned to her seat, closing her laptop just enough to indicate she was done with business for the moment. Her eyes scanned the cabin, aware that dozens of passengers were now silently watching the drama unfold. Some whispered, some exchanged glances of disbelief, and a few subtly lifted their phones, trying to capture a fleeting moment they knew would be retold for months. The senior attendant, a woman in her 40s with streaks of gray in her hair, approached cautiously. "Sir, step aside, please," she said, placing a steadying hand on the younger man's shoulder. "Let's handle this professionally." The young attendant's pride bristled at the touch. I didn't know," he faltered, his voice cracking. He glanced at Monique again, as if trying to measure whether she would unleash fury or extend mercy. Monique tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp but not angry. "You assumed I didn't belong here," she said softly. "That assumption is unacceptable. Everyone on this plane deserves respect, including me." The young attendant's mouth opened and closed, a fish gasping for air, unable to articulate the words that might salvage his dignity. The cabin was quiet now, every passenger aware that they were witnessing more than a confrontation. They were witnessing authority in its rawest, most composed form. A man in the aisle across leaned forward. She owns this plane," he whispered to his companion. The companion's eyes widened. I think she just told him off, like really told him off." Monique's attention remained unbroken. She leaned back slightly, letting her calm radiate like a shockwave through the cabin. Power, she knew, was silent. It didn't need to be loud. It needed only to be undeniable. The young attendant finally stepped aside, muttering under his breath, I'm sorry." But his apology lacked conviction. Pride and embarrassment wrestled within him, a storm he had never learned to navigate. Monique's fingers returned to her laptop, lightly tapping the keyboard, though her mind was acutely aware of every eye in the cabin. Whispers continued, soft but persistent, as passengers debated the veracity of her claim and the audacity with which she had delivered it. "Excuse me, ma'am," the senior attendant said quietly. She leaned closer, her voice low and respectful. "Do you want me to escort him to the back, to prevent further tension?" Monique considered her for a moment. Her eyes flicked toward the aisle where the young attendant now hovered, uncertain and humiliated. "Yes," she said finally, her tone calm but absolute. "Calmly, but firmly. He needs to understand that authority is earned through respect, not aggression." The senior attendant nodded, her respect for Monique evident in the slight bow of her head. She guided the young man away, gently but firmly, toward the rear of the plane. He walked with a mix of reluctance and resignation, the weight of humiliation evident in each step. Passengers' attention returned to Monique, their curiosity now tinged with admiration. Cameras were lowered, phones discreetly put away, but the whispers persisted. She just owned him. Wow. Did she really own the plane? I mean, that's insane. I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that, ever. Monique ignored the murmurs, focusing instead on the sense of awareness that had settled over the cabin. She had not only asserted her position, but she had reminded everyone around her that assumptions, especially assumptions based on appearance, were dangerous. Respect, she knew, was non-negotiable. Yet the encounter had left a ripple in the air, a subtle tension that hinted at unresolved energy. Monique was aware that passengers and crew alike would now be watching her, testing boundaries, assessing reactions. She adjusted her posture, seated firmly, and opened her laptop once more, though this time her focus was different. She observed, measured, and anticipated. A young woman across the aisle, clutching a handbag, leaned forward cautiously. "Ma'am, are you really the owner of this plane?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but her eyes were wide with a mixture of disbelief and awe. "Yes," Monique replied simply, her tone even, unflustered. "And that comes with responsibilities, not just for myself but for everyone aboard. Authority is not about intimidation. It's about ensuring fairness and respect for all." The woman's jaw dropped slightly. The realization seemed to hit her in waves. I've never seen anyone handle that like you did," she whispered. Monique smiled faintly, not out of vanity, but from the satisfaction of having conveyed a lesson without raising her voice. She had turned a potentially humiliating confrontation into a statement of principle, one that passengers would likely discuss long after the flight ended. Meanwhile, the young attendant lingered at the back, shoulders slumped, a mixture of shame and grudging respect forming in his expression. He had thought authority meant asserting power over others, but Monique had demonstrated that true authority was calm, measured, and undeniable. As the cabin settled back into the low hum of flight, a subtle shift was evident. Eyes that had once looked past her now lingered with recognition. Whispers were replaced with glances of respect, nods from those who had seen the encounter. Even the senior attendant, who had walked away to manage the young man, cast a glance of approval back toward Monique. The ripple effect of her statement was already spreading. Passengers would carry the story, retell it, and remember it. They would remember the woman who had reminded everyone on a plane that dignity, respect, and authority could not be assumed. They must be recognized and honored. Monique's hands rested lightly on her laptop, her eyes calm, but inside her mind was already racing ahead. This was just one incident, one small demonstration of authority, but it had reminded her why she had built an empire in the first place. Challenges, assumptions, and resistance would always exist, but they could be met with composure, clarity, and confidence. And yet, she knew that the flight was far from over. The cabin was still alive with tension beneath the surface, curiosity simmering in the eyes of those who had witnessed the encounter. Somewhere, a challenge might arise again, someone testing boundaries, someone unaware of who they were dealing with. Monique exhaled slowly, letting the tension roll off her shoulders like water. She was ready for whatever came next. Suspense. Would the passengers or crew attempt another confrontation? And how far would Monique go to ensure that respect and her authority remained unchallenged for the rest of the flight? The cabin had settled into a deceptive calm, but Monique Harris knew better. Tension lingered in the air like static electricity, charged and unpredictable. Every eye that had glanced at her now lingered a little longer. The passengers weren't just watching, they were assessing, measuring, questioning. Some of them even whispered among themselves, exchanging incredulous glances that said, "Who is this woman?" The young attendant lingered at the back, slumped against a wall, shoulders stiff with humiliation. His movements betrayed his inner conflict, a mix of fear, embarrassment, and reluctant admiration. He wasn't used to being overpowered, not with words, not with composure. Monique had shattered the very script he had rehearsed in his mind, replacing it with a new reality. One in which authority wasn't tied to age, uniform, or gender. It was tied to presence, poise, and unshakable confidence. "Is she really the owner?" a middle-aged man murmured to his companion, his voice hushed but urgent. His companion's eyes were wide, disbelief etched into every line of his face. I think she just reminded that kid who's really in charge." Monique, sitting upright in her seat, heard the whispers but didn't react. Her fingers rested lightly on the laptop keyboard, but her mind was alert, observing every subtle motion in the cabin. A nervous foot tapping, a hand tightening around a coffee cup, the quick, anxious glances of people who realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Then came the first ripple of escalation. A man a few rows back, dressed in a sharp business suit, cleared his throat and stood abruptly. His eyes flicked toward Monique, but there was something different in his posture, a challenge hidden behind a veneer of polite curiosity. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began, voice formal, controlled. "I don't mean to be disrespectful, but how does one come to own a plane? I mean all of this." He gestured vaguely toward the first-class cabin, the plush leather seats, the soft lighting. Monique looked at him directly, her gaze unwavering. She could sense the curiosity, the subtle skepticism, the tiny challenge hidden behind his polished words. "Owning this plane," she said slowly, deliberately, "is not just about the plane itself. It's about responsibility for the people aboard it, for the crew who manage it, for the passengers who trust that safety and respect will always come first. That is what ownership truly means." The man blinked, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "I see, that's impressive." But Monique wasn't finished. She leaned back slightly, her eyes sweeping the cabin, letting her words resonate. "Assumptions can be dangerous," she added, voice calm but firm. "Assuming someone doesn't belong based on appearance, gender, or race is a mistake that has consequences. Respect is not optional." The cabin went silent again. Even the engine's steady hum seemed to pause, replaced by the weight of her statement. Passengers shifted in their seats, some nodding subtly, others staring in disbelief. Few had ever encountered a presence like hers, a mix of authority, elegance, and moral clarity that made resistance feel almost impossible. Meanwhile, the young attendant stood frozen at the back, visibly struggling to process what had just occurred. His initial aggression had been replaced by confusion, shame, and an almost reverent fear. He was beginning to understand, perhaps too late, that authority didn't come from posture or volume. It came from command of self, of surroundings, and of principle. The senior attendant returned, guiding him toward a side aisle. She leaned close, whispering something to him that Monique couldn't hear, but the young man's shoulders slumped further. Humiliation and comprehension warred on his face. He had been bested not by anger, but by composure, by intellect, and by undeniable presence. Then another passenger made a subtle move. A young woman near the window leaned forward, curiosity and admiration in her eyes. "Ma'am," she said softly, "I'm sorry, I've never seen anyone handle that like you did. How did you stay so calm?" Monique's gaze softened, though it retained its authority. Calmness isn't about ignoring the challenge. It's about acknowledging it, understanding it, and responding in a way that commands respect without creating chaos. People will always test boundaries. The key is to respond in a way that leaves no doubt who you are and what is acceptable. The young woman nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson, her eyes wide with awe. Around her, other passengers were listening now, hanging on every word. Phones were subtly lifted, discreetly recording snippets. The whispers grew into murmurs of astonishment. "She's incredible," someone said. "Who even is she?" another added. "I want to tell my friends about this flight." Monique leaned back, letting her gaze wander across the cabin. She observed the passengers with a subtle satisfaction. The ripple of awareness spreading from the aisle had reached the far corners of the plane. People were reconsidering assumptions, reevaluating their judgments and quietly acknowledging a new hierarchy, not of wealth or position, but of respect, authority, and poise. But then came a new tension, unexpected and raw. A child, no more than 7, stood in the aisle with wide eyes, clutching a stuffed animal. His mother, flustered, reached for him but stopped short, clearly anxious. The child's gaze met Monique's. Something in her presence, the calm confidence, the undeniable authority, drew him closer, unafraid. Without hesitation, Monique rose from her seat, gliding toward them with the same effortless command she had displayed during the confrontation moments ago. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly, bending to his level. Her voice was gentle, but there was an edge of authority that conveyed safety and trust simultaneously. "You're safe. I've got you." The mother exhaled in relief, tears welling in her eyes. Passengers shifted in their seats again, some secretly amazed at the seamless transition from confrontation to care. Monique guided the child back to his seat, ensuring he was secure before returning to her own, her posture unbroken, her composure intact. The cabin's tension had shifted yet again. Now it was no longer just curiosity or awe, it was respect, admiration, and something deeper. A recognition that the woman in first class wielded power not through dominance, but through presence, principle, and quiet authority. The young attendant at the back finally seemed to collapse inward, his eyes reflecting a mixture of shame and understanding. He had learned a lesson he would not forget, that authority imposed by fear or assumption would always crumble when faced with composure and clarity. Monique returned to her laptop, fingers lightly resting on the keyboard, but her mind remained alert. She had commanded respect, redirected chaos, and reminded everyone in the cabin of a fundamental truth. Respect is earned, assumptions can be dangerous, and authority is defined by presence, not perception. And yet she knew that the flight was far from over. Tensions lingered beneath the surface. Observers, emboldened or skeptical, might still test boundaries. The ripple effect of her actions would continue, quietly, invisibly, throughout the remaining hours of the flight. Suspense. Would anyone else challenge her, unaware of her authority? Or had Monique firmly established that first class, and the respect it demanded was hers to command? And what unseen challenges awaited, lying in wait among the passengers, ready to ignite if provoked? Monique settled back into her first-class seat, but the atmosphere remained taut with tension. The ripple of awe and whispered conversations had not fully dissipated. In fact, it had grown. The cabin was no longer just a space of ordinary travelers. It had become a theater, every passenger a silent witness to a lesson in authority and composure. The young attendant had retreated to the back, leaning awkwardly against the wall, his uniform rumpled and his pride in tatters. He glanced furtively toward Monique, as though daring himself to believe the reality of her presence. His previous confidence had dissolved, leaving only a fragile shell of uncertainty. Yet there remained a flicker of defiance, a shadow of pride unwilling to vanish entirely. Monique's gaze swept the cabin once more. Every subtle movement, every whispered comment, every lingering stare did not escape her notice. She understood that control in such a space was delicate. It had to be asserted not through force, but through perception, awareness, and unwavering presence. Then, without warning, the young attendant cleared his throat and took a hesitant step forward. "Ma'am," his voice trembled slightly. I didn't mean." "Stop," Monique said, her tone calm but carrying the undeniable weight of authority. It wasn't an angered command. It was the subtle assertion of someone accustomed to being obeyed not out of fear, but because their presence demanded respect. The young man froze, realizing instantly that further words could only worsen his humiliation. From the rear, the senior attendant's measured voice intervened. "He's not here to challenge you," she said softly. "Let him retreat. Let the flight continue." She glanced at Monique, subtly asking if the resolution satisfied her standards. Monique inclined her head slightly. "Ensure he understands why his assumptions were wrong." Calmly, firmly. "I don't want humiliation, I want understanding." The senior attendant nodded and guided the young man toward the back aisle once more. He shuffled obediently, his head lowered, muttering quiet apologies. But this time, there was comprehension in his movements. He now recognized a higher order of authority, one that could not be challenged without consequence. The cabin, however, had absorbed more than just a lesson in authority. Passengers were whispering more actively, their conversations now filled with astonishment and admiration. A mother seated across the aisle leaned toward her teenage daughter. "Did you see that? She didn't yell, she didn't scream, and he froze. He froze." Her daughter's eyes were wide. "I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that, ever, and the way she said it, 'I own this plane.' Wow, just wow." Monique allowed herself a subtle, knowing smile. This wasn't about ego, it was about principle. She had asserted respect not through confrontation alone, but through controlled presence, confidence, and the clear articulation of truth. Assumptions, she knew, were fragile when faced with certainty. As the whispers circulated, a new challenge quietly emerged. A businessman seated a few rows behind her leaned forward, his polished demeanor hiding a subtle curiosity. "Ma'am, I don't want to intrude," he said carefully, "but do you always fly on your own planes?" Monique looked at him steadily, her eyes unwavering. "Not always," she said. "But whenever I do, I expect every passenger and crew member to conduct themselves with respect. That expectation applies to all, regardless of experience, training, or appearance." The man nodded slowly, his expression a mix of respect and disbelief. That's remarkable. I've never seen anyone command respect like that without raising their voice." Monique inclined her head slightly, returning her focus to the cabin. But her calm composure hid a flicker of awareness. She sensed subtle undercurrents among some passengers, small challenges, small tests. Someone might attempt to cross boundaries without understanding the consequences. Her vigilance remained sharp, though her exterior conveyed relaxation. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the emergency exit. A child, no older than 7, had wandered from his mother's seat, clutching a stuffed animal tightly. The mother's face twisted with panic as she called out softly, trying not to alarm other passengers. Monique rose again, her movement fluid and commanding. Every step she took was deliberate, precise, as though she were asserting ownership not through confrontation but through presence. The child froze, uncertainty in his wide eyes. Monique knelt slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "It's okay, sweetheart, I've got you. You're safe." The mother exhaled, tears welling, as Monique guided the child back to his seat with calm authority. Passengers watched, captivated not just by her ownership of the plane, but by her ability to manage chaos, confrontation, and human fear simultaneously. As Monique returned to her seat, she noticed the young attendant observing her from the back, a mixture of shame, respect, and awe on his face. His earlier arrogance had dissolved completely. In its place was comprehension. He understood now that authority wasn't about uniform, age, or volume. It was about presence, composure, and unwavering confidence. The cabin settled once more, but the tension had shifted. It was no longer just confrontation, it was awareness. Passengers now observed every movement, every gesture. Respect had been earned, not demanded. And yet, Monique knew the delicate balance of authority was ongoing. One misstep, one assumption, and the harmony could be disrupted again. From the window, the city lights twinkled below, a reminder of the world outside the cabin. But within these confined walls, Monique held command. Every whisper, every glance, every cautious smile was a testament to her unspoken dominion. She had transformed a routine flight into a stage for a lesson in respect, patience, and authority. Even the young attendant, now quietly at the back, seemed to absorb this lesson fully. His posture remained tense, but his eyes betrayed understanding. He had learned, painfully and humbly, that some authority could not be challenged, and that challenge came at the risk of embarrassment, and perhaps worse. Monique reclined slightly, resting her hands lightly on her laptop, yet her mind remained alert. There was more to observe, more to anticipate. Every passenger, every crew member had their own thresholds, their own assumptions, and her task was not just to assert authority. It was to maintain equilibrium while subtly reminding everyone that respect was non-negotiable. And then came the faintest ripple. A young woman at the far end of first class had lifted her phone, recording discreetly. She wasn't the only one. Monique's eyes met hers for a brief second, acknowledging the act without judgment. Information would spread. Stories would be told. But she remained unshaken, her composure intact. The cabin was alive, quietly reverent, aware of the singular presence that had redefined the unspoken rules of the flight. Monique had proven that ownership, authority, and respect were not abstract concepts. They were lived experiences, enacted in real time, witnessed and absorbed by all around her. Suspense. Even with the confrontation managed and the passengers captivated, Monique sensed it, subtle, lingering tension. Someone somewhere might still misjudge her. Another challenge could arise at any moment. The calm was fragile, the air thick with anticipation, and the next move could either solidify her dominance or ignite a new wave of confrontation. Monique Harris returned to her laptop, but her mind was not on work. The cabin had settled into a tense, almost reverent quiet, but she could feel it, like a current running just beneath the surface. Passengers shifted in their seats, subtle glances exchanged, the faint rustle of papers, the soft clink of a coffee cup. Everyone who had witnessed her confrontation with the young attendant now carried a fragment of awe, curiosity, and maybe even fear. The young attendant remained at the back, rigid and awkward, casting furtive glances toward her seat. Each glance betrayed the internal war within him, pride, embarrassment, and a growing, begrudging respect. He had learned a lesson in authority that would not soon leave him, but it was a lesson accompanied by a gnawing question. What else will this woman do? A murmur rose from a group seated toward the middle of first class. A businessman, his tie slightly loosened, whispered to his neighbor, "I can't believe she just handled that. Without yelling, without threatening, she controlled the room." His companion nodded, eyes wide. "I know, and she owns the plane. I mean, that's insane." Monique allowed herself a slight smile. It wasn't arrogance. It was quiet acknowledgement. She had always known the power of presence, how a calm, measured response could ripple through a room, influence perception, and command respect. But the reactions around her confirmed something deeper. Her authority had fundamentally shifted the social dynamic on the plane. And yet, she knew it was far from over. Authority was a living thing, constantly tested. She sensed subtle challenges still lingering, passengers whose assumptions had not yet been fully recalibrated. She allowed herself to observe quietly, letting her calm composure speak volumes without saying another word. Then another ripple appeared. A young woman sitting near the window leaned forward, curiosity and admiration in her eyes. "Ma'am, I've never seen anyone handle that like you did. How did you stay so calm?" Monique looked at her steadily, letting her gaze convey both authority and reassurance. "Calmness," she said softly, "is not about ignoring the challenge. It's about understanding it, assessing it, and responding in a way that ensures respect is maintained. People will test boundaries. The difference is in how you respond, decisively, clearly, without losing control." The young woman nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson. Around them, other passengers were watching, captivated by the quiet but undeniable power emanating from Monique. Phones were discreetly lifted, recording snippets of conversation, her every measured movement, her effortless control of the situation. A soft chime indicated a flight attendant call from the galley. Monique observed, noting the tension in the crew's movements as they prepared to serve meals. She had mastered the art of reading a room, and she understood that authority extended beyond confrontation. It was in the subtleties, the pauses, the way a presence could command attention without force. But then an unexpected challenge arose. A man a few rows back, sharply dressed, leaned toward her, voice low but clearly audible to those nearby. "I mean seriously, you own this plane, all this." His hand swept toward the cabin's plush seats, the subtle luxury, the quiet hum of order. His tone carried skepticism disguised as curiosity. Monique looked at him calmly. "Owning a plane," she said, "is not about the material aspects. It's about responsibility. Responsibility for safety, for fairness, for the treatment of every person on board. That is what true ownership demands." The man blinked, caught off guard by the clarity and weight of her statement. He nodded slowly, an acknowledgement of respect that seemed almost reluctant. Around them, passengers absorbed the exchange, realizing that Monique's authority was not performative. It was real, substantive, and uncompromising. As she returned her attention to her laptop, Monique's mind remained alert. She sensed another ripple in the cabin, a subtle movement, a shift in attention. A child had wandered slightly from his seat, clutching a small stuffed animal, his mother's face twisted with panic as she tried to reach him without alarming others. Monique rose once more, her movements fluid and commanding. Every step carried weight, every gesture communicated control without aggression. She reached the child, kneeling slightly to his level. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said gently but firmly. "You're safe. I've got you." The child's wide eyes softened, the tension in his small frame easing as he allowed her to guide him back to his seat. The mother exhaled, relief flooding her features, tears threatening to spill. Passengers watched in silent admiration, captivated by the seamless transition from confrontation to care, authority to empathy. Even the young attendant at the back seemed to shrink further, shoulders tight, eyes reflecting a complex mix of shame, respect, and awe. His initial arrogance had been dismantled, replaced with comprehension. Authority was not tied to uniform or age, but to presence, composure, and the ability to command without force. Monique returned to her seat, settling with quiet grace, hands lightly resting on her laptop. She observed, measured, and anticipated. Authority, she knew, was a living force, constantly tested, constantly observed, and constantly reaffirmed. One wrong move, one assumption, could destabilize the delicate equilibrium she had established. And yet there was a subtle sense of triumph in the cabin. Whispers circulated, admiration hummed quietly, and respect, earned, undeniable, saturated the air. The young attendant had learned a painful but vital lesson. Passengers had witnessed authority that transcended appearances, one that balanced power with empathy, command with understanding. Monique exhaled slowly, allowing herself a brief moment of reflection. This flight had become more than a routine journey. It had become a demonstration of principle, a lesson in respect, and a testament to the subtle but unshakable power of composure. She had navigated confrontation, chaos, and skepticism without aggression, relying only on presence, clarity, and moral authority. Yet the awareness that authority is never static lingered. Challenges could arise even subtly. Another passenger, a skeptic or someone unaware of her status, could test boundaries again. The balance she had established was delicate, and Monique remained alert, ready to respond. She glanced toward the rear of the cabin. The young attendant, once brimming with misguided confidence, now slouched, his eyes cast downward. The senior attendant had returned to her duties but occasionally glanced toward Monique, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. The lesson had been delivered, and it had been absorbed. Monique returned to her laptop, her focus shifting back to business, but the cabin itself had changed. The passengers, the crew, even the young attendant had absorbed an unspoken truth. Respect was earned, authority was recognized, and assumptions could be dangerous. Suspense. Though the confrontation had been managed, Monique sensed the undercurrents of curiosity and tension still present. Would another passenger or crew member test her? Could she maintain control for the remainder of the flight? And what unexpected challenge might still be waiting in the seemingly calm skies above? The cabin had quieted, but Monique Harris knew that stillness was deceptive. She could feel the undercurrent of tension running through the aisles, in the slight shifts of passengers, in the subtle glances from the crew. Authority was never permanent. It was tested again and again, in small challenges, in assumptions, in moments of curiosity that might turn into defiance. She allowed herself a brief glance out the window. The city lights glimmered beneath the plain, small pinpoints of life in the dark, but within the cabin, a different kind of energy had taken hold, a charged, taut current that left every observer slightly breathless. She was not just traveling, she was performing a silent symphony of authority, composure, and control. The young attendant, now fully subdued, lingered near the rear, shoulders slumped, eyes darting occasionally toward her. Pride and embarrassment warred within him, leaving him awkward, unsure, and profoundly aware of his own limitations. He had confronted someone he assumed to be ordinary, only to discover that power need not shout to command respect. From a few rows up, a businessman leaned toward his neighbor, whispering just loudly enough for Monique to hear. "She's incredible. I've never seen someone manage a confrontation like that." His neighbor nodded, eyes wide with disbelief. "I know, and she didn't even raise her voice. It's like she owns this space entirely." Monique's eyes swept the cabin again, subtle, assessing, observing. She noticed a few passengers still hesitant, uncertain about the unspoken hierarchy she had imposed. Some were curious, some cautious, some silently testing boundaries. She allowed herself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't vanity, it was awareness. Challenges were inevitable, but she had prepared for them. Then, almost imperceptibly, a ripple of activity caught her attention. A young man seated near the aisle had lifted a magazine, pretending to read, but his gaze flicked toward her repeatedly. It was subtle, almost innocuous, but she recognized it. The first sign of a test. Someone curious, wondering if her authority extended beyond confrontation, if it could be challenged in other ways. Monique leaned back, allowing herself a moment of stillness, knowing that patience was as potent as action. The young man shifted again, clearly struggling with what he perceived as a potential imbalance of power. She let him squirm, her calm presence a silent assertion of dominance. Respect, after all, was most effective when observed quietly, when the audience understood the stakes without being told. Suddenly, the soft chime of a flight attendant call sounded from the galley. Crew members moved with a mixture of professionalism and apprehension, aware that the cabin's energy had shifted in subtle but palpable ways. Every movement was observed, every gesture measured, and Monique's presence influenced it all. A mother nearby leaned toward her teenage daughter, whispering, "Did you see that? The way she handled him without yelling, without force, it's unreal." The daughter's eyes were wide, admiration written across her features. "I know," she replied softly. "It's like she's in charge of the entire plane just by being herself." Monique's gaze shifted, noting the small moments of recognition. Authority was not just a moment. It was cumulative, built from perception, consistency, and subtle influence. She had demonstrated strength, composure, and empathy simultaneously, and the cabin was absorbing the lesson in real time. But the flight had not yet reached its climax. As she observed, a subtle commotion began at the very rear of the plane. The young attendant had stumbled, nearly dropping a tray of drinks, his nerves fraying under the weight of embarrassment and lingering curiosity. The tray wobbled dangerously, eliciting a collective gasp from nearby passengers. Monique rose without hesitation. Her movements were precise, commanding yet composed as she approached him. "It's all right," she said softly, laying a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Focus, control, you're capable, you've already learned the lesson, now apply it." The young man froze, a mixture of shock and relief passing over his features. Her calm authority steadied him in a way no words from a supervisor ever could. He straightened, taking a deep breath, understanding finally that her influence was not fleeting. It was inherent, undeniable, and exacting. Returning to her seat, Monique allowed a brief exhale, though her mind remained acutely aware. Authority was a living force, tested continuously, and she had sensed that passengers were still processing the events. Whispers continued, phones subtly lifted, and eyes returned repeatedly to her seat, drawn by her presence, her calm, and the undeniable aura of power she radiated. And then the unexpected occurred. A flight attendant approached, her expression a mixture of anxiety and urgency. "Ma'am, we have a situation near the front. A passenger has become unwell and they're panicking. Could you assist?" Monique's eyes narrowed slightly, registering the gravity of the moment. This was no longer about authority, assumption, or ego. It was about responsibility. She stood, moving with the same fluid confidence that had defined the previous encounters, and approached the front of the cabin. The passenger, a middle-aged man, was pale, his breathing shallow and uneven. The attendant had tried to calm him, but his anxiety had escalated, drawing attention from nearby travelers. Monique knelt beside him, her voice firm yet soothing. "You're safe," she said, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Breathe with me. In and out, steady now." The man's eyes widened as he realized the calm presence beside him was the same woman who had commanded the cabin moments before. His panic eased slightly under her composed guidance. I don't, thank you," he whispered, voice shaky. Monique guided him through controlled breathing, subtly instructing the attendants on how to assist without alarming other passengers. The cabin watched, captivated by the seamless blend of authority and empathy, control and compassion. Her presence alone had stabilized what could have become chaos. Even the young attendant at the back, observing the scene, seemed to shrink further into humility. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by profound respect, understanding that Monique's power extended beyond confrontation. It encompassed leadership, responsibility, and moral authority. As the situation settled, Monique returned to her seat, her hands resting lightly on her laptop. The cabin had absorbed yet another lesson. Authority was not only about asserting oneself, but about managing crisis, protecting others, and inspiring confidence without intimidation. The murmurs continued, passengers sharing quiet conversations about what they had witnessed. Phones were discreetly lifted, stories quietly recorded, and whispers of admiration circulated like a subtle undercurrent throughout the cabin. Monique exhaled, knowing that the flight had transformed from a routine journey into a living classroom of authority, presence, and respect. She had navigated confrontation, curiosity, panic, and human frailty with skill, composure, and moral clarity. Yet she remained aware that the delicate balance of power could still be tested. Suspense. Even with the immediate crisis managed, Monique sensed subtle undercurrents of curiosity and potential challenge lingering in the cabin. Would another passenger, unaware of her authority, test boundaries again? Could she maintain control through the remainder of the flight, or was another confrontation waiting just beyond the next aisle? The cabin had fallen into a delicate rhythm, but Monique Harris remained alert. The earlier confrontations, the child's wandering, the panicked passenger, all of it had tested her composure, her authority, and her ability to command respect without raising her voice. Now, the tension had transformed into a quiet anticipation. The passengers were no longer merely curious. They were waiting, unconsciously, to see what she would do next. Even the young attendant at the back seemed frozen in time. His eyes, wide with lingering disbelief, followed her every movement. He had learned his lesson in humility, but the residual tension in his shoulders suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable yet. He remained alert, ready to react, unsure whether another challenge would come from Monique, or if he would have to rise to meet it himself. Monique leaned back slightly, fingers lightly brushing her laptop. She allowed herself a moment to scan the cabin. Whispers still moved through the rows, subtle but continuous like a river beneath the surface. Phones had been lifted discreetly, capturing snippets of her calm authority and the earlier confrontations. She knew the story would spread, but right now, she was focused on the present, every heartbeat, every glance, every potential challenge. Then it happened. A middle-aged woman, seated near the center of first class, began to argue quietly with the flight attendant about the placement of her luggage. The woman's tone was polite, but her body language was assertive, almost confrontational. She shifted in her seat, gesturing toward the overhead bins as though claiming a minor victory in a battle only she perceived. Monique's gaze immediately found the woman. Calm, controlled, she closed her laptop with a soft click. The cabin seemed to pause for the faintest moment, as if sensing another test. Rising from her seat, Monique moved toward the woman with deliberate, fluid confidence. Her posture, her composure, and the subtle weight of her presence carried authority without aggression. Every passenger who noticed her rising leaned slightly forward, anticipation sparking in their eyes. "Excuse me," Monique said, her voice calm but firm, carrying a resonance that drew the attention of the entire cabin. "I believe there's a misunderstanding here. Let's resolve this together calmly." The woman froze for a moment, her hand hovering over the bin. Then she gestured vaguely, voice slightly higher than intended. I want my bag in the space closest to me. That's all. I don't see why it's a problem." Monique's eyes held hers. "Of course, you are entitled to that space, but we must also consider others. There is a proper way to ensure everyone's belongings are accommodated. I will help you with this, and we will make it right without conflict." The woman blinked, taken aback by the calm authority in Monique's tone. She hadn't expected to be addressed like this, not firmly, but kindly. The earlier whisper of tension dissipated, replaced by a quiet understanding that the woman's minor challenge would be resolved, not ignored or dismissed. Monique guided her gently to adjust the luggage, demonstrating the correct placement. The cabin watched silently, riveted by the combination of composure, authority, and practical action. What could have been a confrontation became a demonstration of leadership. Meanwhile, the young attendant watched from the back, absorbing the lesson. He had already learned humility, but now he saw authority in action, not confrontation, not aggression, but resolution, empathy, and composure combined. His shoulders relaxed slightly, though his eyes still held awe. He was learning that true power didn't demand fear, it inspired respect, often quietly, often imperceptibly. The ripple of observation spread. Passengers whispered to each other, sharing astonishment and admiration. Phones were lifted discreetly, capturing more snippets for social media. A teenager seated near the window nudged her mother, whispering, "Mom, she's amazing. The way she handles everyone without yelling." Monique returned to her seat, settling with the grace of someone entirely comfortable in command. But her awareness remained acute. She could sense the subtle energy in the cabin, the curiosity, the tentative testing of boundaries, the quiet admiration. Authority, she knew, was both fragile and potent. It could shift with a glance, a gesture, or a single word. Then came another ripple, this time from the cockpit. A gentle but urgent announcement echoed over the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing minor turbulence ahead. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." Passengers shifted uneasily, some gripping armrests, others leaning slightly forward with apprehension. The cabin's energy shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Anxiety and fear moved silently through the rows. Monique observed calmly, recognizing that this was another test, not of defiance but of composure under uncertainty. She leaned back, placing her hands lightly on her laptop. Then she spoke, softly but with quiet authority, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This turbulence is temporary. Please remain seated. It is safe. There is nothing to fear." Her words, calm and measured, radiated reassurance. The nervous passengers shifted slightly, some exhaling, some nodding, their fear tempered by the undeniable authority in her voice. The ripple effect of her presence had reached the entire cabin. She had transformed anxiety into calm awareness without raising her voice, without force, simply by asserting presence and clarity. Even the young attendant, observing from the back, seemed to relax further. He had watched authority exercised in confrontation, empathy, and crisis. Now he was witnessing it exercised during turbulence, uncertainty, and fear. The lesson was profound. Authority was as much about presence in calm as in chaos, about guiding others through uncertainty with composure and clarity. Monique leaned back fully, exhaling softly. The cabin, though still charged with subtle tension, had become a testament to her command. She had navigated confrontation, curiosity, fear, and crisis without aggression, and every passenger had absorbed it in some measure. Respect, she knew, had been earned, quietly and irrevocably. And yet she sensed it, another undercurrent, subtle, almost imperceptible. Someone somewhere might still challenge her. Perhaps not with words, perhaps not openly, but there was always the possibility of testing boundaries, even unknowingly. The flight was far from over, and authority, once earned, had to be continuously affirmed. Suspense. As Monique maintained calm amid turbulence and latent challenges, a final test seemed imminent. Would another passenger or crew member unknowingly cross a line, forcing her to assert authority once more? Or would the remainder of the flight settle into the tense but respectful equilibrium she had crafted? The cabin held its collective breath, waiting to see. The turbulence had passed, leaving a tense stillness in the cabin. Monique Harris remained seated, hands resting lightly on her laptop, but her eyes swept the rows like a quiet sentinel. She knew that authority is never fully secure. It is always observed, tested, and recalibrated by those around it. Even now, subtle energy lingered. Curiosity, residual tension, admiration, and perhaps the faintest glimmer of challenge. The young attendant at the back shifted nervously. His earlier arrogance had crumbled completely, replaced with humility and deep respect. Every subtle movement he made now reflected caution and perhaps a lingering fear of misstepping again. But beneath that apprehension, Monique noticed something else, a spark of understanding, the beginnings of growth. He had witnessed authority in its purest form, not imposed but inherently recognized. Passengers whispered quietly, their voices a soft murmur beneath the hum of the engines. Phones were discreetly lowered, conversations exchanged with wide eyes. Some shook their heads in disbelief. "I can't believe how she handled everything," one whispered. "Without shouting, without threatening, just presence." Monique leaned back slightly, scanning the cabin, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the quiet nods of respect. The way the conversations had turned into discussions about composure, confidence, and calm authority. The ripple effect of her actions had transformed the atmosphere. First class, once just a space of comfort, had become a theater of silent lessons in respect, humility, and power. But just as she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, a commotion arose near the rear. The young attendant had accidentally dropped a beverage cart, sending cups rattling and spilling liquids across the aisle. Gasps and murmurs filled the cabin as passengers glanced toward the noise, some alarmed, some curious. Monique rose immediately, moving with the same fluid authority she had displayed throughout the flight. Each step radiated control and calm, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. She reached the cart and with a few deft movements stabilized it, instructing the young attendant quietly but firmly. Focus. You've learned the lessons already. Apply them now. Calm and deliberate, nothing more is needed. The young man's shoulders straightened imperceptibly, and he followed her guidance, steadying the cart and regaining his composure. Passengers exhaled collectively, some with relief, some with awe. Whispers circulated once more. She just saved that situation without raising her voice. How is she so composed? Monique returned to her seat, a faint smile playing on her lips. But she remained vigilant, her gaze sweeping the cabin. She had navigated confrontation, curiosity, anxiety, and chaos. But authority, she knew, was continuously tested. She allowed the passengers a brief moment to absorb the lesson, to recognize that respect had been earned through clarity, calm, and unwavering presence. From across the aisle, a mother leaned toward her child, whispering, "Did you see that?" She didn't yell, she didn't shout, she just handled everything. The child nodded, wide-eyed, absorbing the lesson silently, while nearby adults exchanged similar glances of quiet admiration. Monique's attention shifted subtly to the cockpit. A brief announcement confirmed that the flight would land ahead of schedule due to clear skies and favorable conditions. She noted the faint pride in the voices of the pilots, unaware of the full impact the cabin had experienced under her guidance. Authority, she thought, was as much about influence as it was about responsibility. She had ensured safety, order, and respect simultaneously, and passengers had witnessed it firsthand. The young attendant, now fully subdued, met her gaze briefly. There was no defiance, only understanding, humility, and acknowledgement. He had learned that true authority was neither shouted nor demanded. It was quietly recognized, consistently applied, and inherently respected. Passengers had begun settling in, reading quietly or adjusting personal devices, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of awe. Social media posts were being drafted in subtle whispers, unseen but persistent, capturing moments that would later be retold countless times. Phones had been discreetly lifted to capture snippets, images of calm authority, moments of composure, and gestures that conveyed more than words ever could. Monique finally allowed herself a deep exhale, relaxing slightly but maintaining awareness. The flight, which had started as an ordinary journey, had transformed into a narrative of authority, composure, and respect. She had turned potential chaos into lessons that each passenger would carry with them far beyond the plane. And then came the final test, unexpected, subtle, and challenging in its own way. The first-class passenger seated closest to the aisle shifted in a manner that indicated irritation, quietly muttering about delays and inconvenience. Her voice was soft, but it carried enough weight for those nearby to notice. Monique's gaze met hers, calm, unflinching, and measured. "Excuse me," Monique said softly, her tone unshakable. "I understand your concern. Please know that every action aboard this plane, from crew to passenger, is guided by safety, respect, and order. Your comfort and security are important, but they must exist alongside consideration for all. I appreciate your understanding." The woman blinked, caught off guard. Her irritation softened, replaced by subtle acknowledgement. Monique's calm, composed, and measured presence had reasserted authority without confrontation, reminding the cabin that respect was both earned and maintained continuously. The remaining flight passed without incident. Passengers remained aware, respectful, and quietly attentive. The young attendant moved with care, subtly improved in demeanor, embodying the lessons he had witnessed throughout the journey. Whispers continued quietly, recounting Monique's actions and the composure she displayed. Finally, the plane began its descent. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the nearing end of the journey. Monique leaned back in her seat, hands resting lightly on her laptop, allowing herself a final moment of reflection. Authority had been tested, humility had been earned, and respect had been affirmed, not through force, but through presence, composure, and clarity of principle. Passengers prepared for landing, adjusting seats and fastening seatbelts. The earlier tension had dissolved, replaced by admiration, quiet awe, and respect. Some exchanged whispered comments about the woman in first class, others glanced discreetly at their phones, documenting memories they would carry with them. As the plane touched down smoothly, the cabin collectively exhaled. Monique remained composed, observing the final moments of the flight with the same quiet authority she had maintained throughout. The young attendant offered a tentative smile, a silent acknowledgement of lessons learned and boundaries respected. Monique gathered her belongings, standing gracefully as the doors opened. Passengers filed out, some offering subtle nods of admiration, others exchanging quiet whispers of astonishment. Cameras and phones had captured moments that would ripple far beyond this single flight. Her authority had transformed not just the cabin, but the perceptions of those who witnessed it. Stepping onto the jet bridge, she allowed herself a final, satisfied breath. The flight had been more than a journey. It had been a living lesson in respect, composure, and quiet, undeniable authority. Every passenger, every crew member, and even the young attendant had witnessed it firsthand. Emotional resolution. Monique had turned confrontation into respect, chaos into calm, and skepticism into awe. The journey, though ordinary in its purpose, had become extraordinary in its impact. She had demonstrated that true authority lies not in shouting or force, but in presence, composure, and unwavering principle. And as she walked toward the terminal, subtle whispers followed behind her. Stories would be told, lessons would be remembered, and passengers would never forget the woman who commanded a plane with nothing but her presence. Suspense and closure. The authority she displayed had transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary, leaving passengers and crew alike with a lesson they would carry forever. And though the plane had landed, the story, like all remarkable lessons, would continue to ripple far beyond the cabin walls.